Policy is Donald Trump, who, of course, most of his policies are broader endorsed within the GOP, both at the elite level, at least in discourse, but definitely at the base level.
And so, I mean, maybe this is a more general question, but when we're talking about movements like this, right? I mean, it's one thing for these groups of people to have these positions and these attitudes, but for their ascendancy, for their being reflected in the lawmakers that they elect, either because these lawmakers are true believers or they feel it necessary to pose as true believers because this is where the electoral base of the party has come from. To what extent, and this, like I say, this could be a generic question, but how much is it reliant on that type of funding? Because, you know, I mean, there's no analog on the left to have the type of infrastructure the Tea Party had in its rise, and maybe this is part of the problem that the Republican Party ended up having, was that you had, you know, for every a person out there who was saying, you know, the Affordable Care Act shouldn't be 100 pages long, or, you know, Barack Obama is not an American citizen, there was a Mark Levin, a Laura Ingraham, a Glenn Beck. There was the AFP spending money on buses and infrastructure and hiring professionalized Tea Party people. I mean, how much did that increase its power, I guess?
I think it was fundamental, but there is an explanation partly for why right-wing money was more effective than left-wing money. And this is in part when you're in opposition. And in the 1970s, but mostly 80s and early 90s, liberalism, particularly defined in the U.S., which is pro-economic integration and pro-multicultural integration, was pretty much hegemonic. And much of the resources went to maintaining the system, whereas the right, and particularly first neoconservatism and then kind of the broader, I would say, radical right, mobilized against that and targeted much clearer organizations. But the other thing is that whereas the right, at least since the 1980s, has always invested a lot in grassroots politics, including at the local and state level, which goes back to the Christian right, but also neoconservatism, the left hasn't. And you see that most dramatically in the 2016 election, where you had a mass movement around Bernie Sanders, which was to a large extent grassroots, but which completely fell apart as soon as Bernie Sanders was not the candidate for the presidential election, because the only thing they focused on was on winning the presidentship, whereas the right has a much broader agenda, and that helps it sustain and it helps its influence, which is phenomenal.
Well, what is it how walk me through how the broader agenda translates into the sustenance of the organization? Well, I mean, is that a funding? I mean, in other words, you know, when Bernie Sanders goes away, right, there's no more money to be raised for him as a presidential candidate. Whereas on the right, the funds are coming. I mean, the money is coming from just many more directions. There's just more bigger players, essentially.
Yes, there are. On the other hand, I mean, Donald Trump spent much less than Marco Rubio or Ted Cruz, and then Clinton, right? And many of the Tea Party movements were local grassroots with really like nickel and dime operations. But what they profited from was the AFP, which gave webinars, for example. Again, one of the things is that there was a much better connection between the grassroots and, let's say, AstroTurf than generally on the left, which has become, first of all, pretty much coastal, and devoid of local politics and state politics, particularly outside of their strongholds. And when you talk about right-wing politics, for example, you don't talk about the presidentships so much. Like, one of the reasons why people like Ralph Reed supported the President Trump is because it was about judges, Supreme Court judges. They're very active on school boards. Like, they pretty much have politicized everything, which means that many of these things which have big consequences, like school boards, you don't need a big budget for. You don't actually need a big budget to win court elections, like judge elections at local or state levels. So they have a lot of money, but they spend it much broader and therefore win much broader.
Interesting. So, all right, let's go. I mean, so how does the Tea Party, I mean, walk us through this notion. I mean, the Tea Party was so prominent, and then it seemed like within the context, like within the span of, I don't know, 12 months, 18 months, 6 months, it seemed to have completely disappeared as an organizing principle. I mean, obviously the people are still there, the issue sets are there, but it was as if one day you had the multitudes identifying themselves as part of the Tea Party movement, and then literally, same time next year, nobody.
Yeah, and I don't want to be overly populist here, but I think this is in part a consequence of an exclusive focus at the federal level as well as kind of at the coastal level, because the Tea Party hadn't fully disappeared from Indiana politics or from Georgia politics. When we had the anti-immigrant legislation that started out in Arizona and was then adopted in various states, including Alabama and Georgia, the local Tea Parties played a major role. But it was no longer the AFP-sponsored and Glenn Beck advertised Tea Party.
Right.
It was now a local, embedded, and grounded groups, and that was mostly within the Midwest and the South, but they were still relevant there. Not anymore that national presence, but they were still mobilized, and probably many of them just now mobilized within the Republican Party, most notably, of course, through the primary system.
So there's an analog there in terms of, let's say, people coming out of the Occupy movement, going into places like the Bernie Sanders campaign or in other sort of, I guess, community organizations. They don't necessarily directly identify, or they just localize their work. So where is the Tea Party now? I mean, is the Tea Party still active? Has it been subsumed by Trump Inc.? Where is it now?
Yeah, I think that what you saw when the Tea Party kind of emerged was that various groups that before that called themselves patriot groups, which were kind of an outflow of the modernization of the militia movements of the 90s, there is some kind of a base, kind of constant base at grassroots levels of activists, which are not exactly the same, but which are a similar type of group, which have been active for a long time and which come up under different headers in different periods. At this point in time, I would imagine that most of the Tea Party groups are no longer using Tea Party labels and are particularly attracted to Trump much more than the Republican Party. And so what they're doing is they are mobilizing for local and regional candidates that are, to a certain extent, exactly the same type of candidates that they argued for during the Tea Party, which still attack the so-called rhinos, the Republicans in name only, but now they also have kind of a positive connotation in the sense of that they are part of the Trump train.
Hi, folks. Sam Seder here. We still need your help on our Patreon page. YouTube ads have come back, but not nearly as much as we had before. So if you can help us out, any little bit helps. head over to our Patreon page right at this URL, and you'll help us keep helping you by making videos